Medieval birth control killed thousands of women, not because they were stupid, because they were desperate. When another pregnancy meant starvation or death, women turned to 14 methods that were banned by the church and condemned by physicians. Mercury, pennyroyal, crocodile dung, violent binding, backward prayers. Some worked. All were dangerous. Today I'm covering every single method, how they were used, why they failed, and how many women died trying to control their own bodies in a world that gave them no other choice. This isn't a story of empowerment, it's a story of survival that turned into suffering. Let's begin with the deadliest. Mercury. Liquid silver. It pooled in shallow dishes, beautiful and mesmerizing under candlelight. Midwives sold it wrapped in cloth with one instruction: 3 drops in wine, no more, and pray. Women didn't know that mercury doesn't distinguish between the fetus and the woman carrying it. It seeps into blood and bones, into brain and kidneys, turning the body into a battlefield where both sides lose. The symptoms started subtle. Tremors in the hands, a metallic taste that wouldn't fade, bleeding gums that stained teeth pink. But desperation erases caution. When 3 drops didn't work, women took 4. Then 5. By the 4th day, hands shook so violently they couldn't hold a cup. By the 7th, gums bled onto pillows during sleep. By the 10th, walking required holding walls for support. Mercury was inherited from Roman and Islamic medical traditions. Physicians like Avicenna wrote about quicksilver in careful clinical language, but women experienced something far removed from theory. Mercury binds to proteins. It crosses membranes. It disrupts cellular function. It damages kidneys first, then the nervous system. And it kills slowly, poisoning both mother and child over weeks of agony. Before we continue, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Today we know mercury as a neurotoxin. It's why pregnant women avoid certain fish. Medieval women had no phthah, no warning labels. They experimented on themselves because they had no other choice. The woman dies 3 weeks after her first dose. Her hands still shaking, her teeth loose in her gums. She's buried in the churchyard's far corner where suicides are laid. The priest doesn't come. Lead was cruder, less elegant, but cheaper and easier to obtain. Medieval Europe was built with lead, pipes, weights, cosmetics, glazes. It leached into water and wine. Chronic lead poisoning was so common it had no name. It was simply life. But intentional consumption was something else entirely. Women ground lead into powder using borrowed mortars. The gray dust coated their fingers. They mixed it into thick pottage to hide the grit and ate it over 3 days. Cramping began on the 2nd day. Sharp, twisting pains low in the belly. They mistook it for success, but the child didn't come. Instead, the pains intensified. Vomiting until throats were raw. Heads pounding with pressure that blurred vision. Confusion set in, forgetting where things were placed, calling daughters by dead sisters' names. When bleeding started, it wasn't the heavy flow expected. It was a slow, continuous seep that didn't stop. Lead damaged kidneys, liver, blood itself. The body, poisoned, could no longer regulate. Women died 3 weeks later, their teeth blackened, their minds unraveling. Lead crosses the placenta easily. It's an equal opportunity poison. Medieval texts described these substances euphemistically as things that could restore the menses or bring down the flowers, coded language for inducing miscarriage. The fact that they killed the woman as often as the fetus was seen as divine punishment, not medical tragedy. But poisons weren't the only option. Some women turned to plants. Pennyroyal, a common mint that grew low to the ground, used to flavor stews and repel fleas from bedding. But women knew its other purpose. They called it squaw mint, pudding grass, run by the ground. And in the coded language of midwives, the bringer down. Women picked it in early morning when dew still clung to leaves and no one was awake to see. A handful was enough. They boiled it strong, drank it hot, and waited. It would hurt, they were told. But it would work. Pennyroyal contains pulegon, a compound that triggers uterine contractions. Medieval herbalists knew the plant caused cramping and brought bleeding. What they didn't understand was that peulagon destroys the liver, and the effective dose sits dangerously close to the lethal dose. There's almost no margin for error. The tea turned dark green. The smell of mint became overwhelming, acrid, nauseating. Women drank it while it was still hot enough to burn their throats. The taste was bitter beyond bearing. Cramping started within the hour. Pain that coiled around the lower belly like rope pulled tight. But something else came too. Nausea rising in waves. Dizziness that made rooms tilt. Skin alternating between hot and cold. Vomiting the green tea back up along with everything else. By evening, the whites of eyes began to yellow. By next morning, urine was dark as ale. The cramping hadn't stopped, but now it was joined by deeper pain beneath the ribs. The liver was failing. Peulagon had triggered contractions, yes, but it had also begun destroying liver cells faster than the body could repair them. Pennyroyal oil is still sold today in health stores. The FDO warns against internal use because it still destroys livers just like it did 600 years ago. The plant hasn't changed. The desperation hasn't either. Tansy was similar, taller with button-like yellow flowers and a stronger scent, camphor and bitterness. Another common garden plant used to flavor Easter cakes and preserve meat. Another plant with a shadow reputation. The active compound is thujone, a neurotoxin that causes convulsions and kidney damage in high doses. Medieval manuscripts mention tansy in recipes for bringing down obstructed menses, a euphemism so common it appears in texts from England to Italy. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess and herbalist, warned against its overuse, noting it could cause great harm to inner organs. Women made strong infusions, sometimes combining tansy with other herbs, rue, savin, ergot from blighted grain. They drank it over 2 days, forcing down cup after cup of bitter liquid. On the third day, seizures began. Bodies locked rigid, backs arching, jaws clenched so tight teeth cracked. Convulsions came in waves, each one leaving women weaker, more disoriented. Foam appeared at the corners of mouths. Eyes rolled back. When bleeding finally started, they were barely conscious. The child came away in pieces, but hemorrhaging didn't stop. Bodies damaged by thujone couldn't clot properly. They bled into straw mattresses until soaked black. There was no physician, no priest. Only sisters who burned the tansy still drying in rafters and told villages it was childbed fever. The herbs weren't fake. They were real. That was the tragedy. They worked just well enough to be passed down through generations, mother to daughter, midwife to desperate woman. But they worked without precision, without mercy, without the chemical knowledge that might have made them safe. But herbs weren't the only knowledge inherited from the ancient world. Some methods came from Egypt, from papyri, written thousands of years before the medieval period. The principle was simple. Create a barrier. Block the seed before it could take root. Crocodile dung. Elephant dung. Sometimes honey mixed with natron, a natural salt. Sometimes acacia gum ground into paste. These substances, shaped into small plugs or pessaries, were inserted into the vagina before intercourse. The theory wasn't entirely wrong. Acacia gum, when fermented, produces lactic acid, which is mildly spermicidal. Honey has antibacterial properties and creates a thick, hostile environment. But crocodile dung is simply filth. And medieval women weren't working with pharmaceutical-grade materials. They were working in the dark with whatever they could find. Women needed mixtures in their hands. Stolen honey, ash from hearths, paste made from dried herbs they couldn't name. Instructions came third hand, whispered by peddler women who claimed to have learned them from Moorish physicians. The mixtures were thick, sticky, difficult to shape. Women formed them into small ovals and wrapped them in scraps of linen so thin they were nearly transparent. Insertion was painful, awkward. Women had to crouch and reach and push foreign objects inside themselves deeper than seemed possible until they sat against the neck of the womb. The linen wrapper was meant to allow removal later, a string to pull when danger passed. But strings were thin, and bodies, once something foreign is introduced, don't always cooperate. In wealthier households, pessaries were more sophisticated. Beeswax molded and cooled into smooth shapes. Wool soaked in vinegar or wine. Small sponges, rare and expensive, brought from Mediterranean ports. Some women used pomegranate pulp, crushed and mixed with alum. Others used oil and lead, despite knowing what lead could do. What texts didn't mention was the infection. The fever that began 2 days later, 3 days, a week. The body recognizes foreign objects and responds with inflammation. If the pessary wasn't removed in time, or if it broke apart inside, risk multiplied. Bacteria entered through the cervix. The uterus became a site of infection. Sepsis followed. Blood poisoning that spread faster than any remedy could chase it. Fevers developed on the 4th day. Low at first, manageable. By the 6th day, delirium. Bodies burned. Skin of bellies became hot to the touch, tender, swollen. Women tried to remove pessaries but couldn't find strings. They had slipped inside, dissolved, been pulled loose. Something was wrong deep inside. Something they couldn't reach, couldn't fix, couldn't confess to anyone without admitting what they'd done. Women died of septic shock 11 days after insertion. Infections spread to bloodstreams, organs. They were buried quickly in summer heat before the smell grew worse. Husbands didn't understand what killed them. Priests muttered about God's judgment on women's frailty. Peddler women who sold instructions moved on to the next village, carrying their dangerous knowledge like disease. The methods were born from necessity and ancient wisdom, but practiced in ignorance and filth. The barrier between life and death was thinner than linen wrapped around a plug of honey and ash. When subtlety failed, women turned to force. Binding. The cloth was wound tight, so tight that breathing became a deliberate act, a struggle against constriction. Women wrapped it around their bellies in layers, pulling each turn tighter than the last, until flesh beneath began to ache, until ribs protested, until pressure was almost unbearable. The logic was brutal and simple. Compress the womb, restrict its expansion, deny the growing child the space it needs, starve it of room, crush it before it can take hold. Some women began binding early, at the first missed monthly blood. Others waited until quickening, until movement could be felt. Women wrapped themselves each morning and didn't remove binding until night. They worked in fields with cloth cutting into skin, breathing shallow, movements restricted. Pressure was constant. After 3 days, skin beneath binding was raw, weeping. After a week, bruises bloomed across ribs in shades of purple and yellow. Pain became normal. They forgot what it felt like to breathe deeply. But children didn't dislodge. Instead, women's bodies began to fail. Ribs cracked under sustained pressure. Abdominal muscles, compressed for weeks, began to atrophy. Digestion faltered. Food couldn't move properly through intestines squeezed into unnatural positions. Women became weak, dizzy, unable to keep down what little they ate. And still they tightened binding each morning, because the alternative was unthinkable. When binding failed, some turned to more direct violence. Deliberate falls, throwing themselves down stairs, off walls, from haylofts, blows to the abdomen delivered by their own fists or by accomplices too desperate or too paid to refuse, jumping from heights onto hard ground, hoping impact would jar loose what wouldn't come naturally. Medieval court records occasionally mention women injured or killed in suspicious falls. Their pregnancies ended along with their lives. The line between accident and intention was deliberately blurred. Binding is unwound only when women are too weak to tie it themselves. Ribs broken in 3 places. Abdomens, a mass of bruises and infected wounds where fabric has cut through skin. Not eating for 5 days. The child inside, if it still lives, is damaged beyond survival. But women won't live to see whether it would have been born. Bodies crushed and starved and broken give out 3 days later. The violence wasn't accidental. It was the method. Others turned to the surgeons. Not university-trained physicians who served nobility, but barber surgeons, tooth pullers, Men who set bones and lanced boils and asked few questions if payment was sufficient. These men had blades. They had crude knowledge of anatomy, and they had seen enough desperation to know what was being asked when a woman came to them in secret, speaking of obstructions and blockages that needed clearing. Procedures were performed in back rooms that smelled of old blood and tallow smoke. No anesthetic beyond strong ale. No sterilization beyond wiping blades on cloth. Women lay on rough tables, legs spread, while barber surgeons probed with instruments never meant for this purpose. Hooked tools designed for extracting teeth were forced through the cervix into the uterus itself. Women screamed. Pain was beyond anything imagined. But surgeons continued, scraping, pulling, trying to dislodge pregnancies by force. Bleeding was immediate and catastrophic. Uterine walls, perforated by crude instruments, couldn't contract properly. Blood poured out in quantities that shocked even surgeons. They packed wounds with cloth, but bleeding didn't stop. Infection would set in within hours. Unsterilized instruments introduced bacteria directly into the uterus. But women usually died of blood loss before infection had time to kill them. Bloodletting was another method, born from medieval medical theory of humors. If the body could be weakened sufficiently, if enough blood could be drained, perhaps pregnancy would fail. Women sat while barber surgeons opened veins in their arms, their ankles, letting blood flow into basins until they became faint. The theory was that by reducing the body's vital force, pregnancy, which required that force, would naturally terminate. It didn't work. Or rather, it worked only by killing the woman before the child. Severe blood loss causes shock, organ failure, death. Some women survived bloodletting, but were left so weakened they couldn't fight off infections or complications that followed. They died slowly over weeks, bodies unable to recover from violence inflicted upon them in the name of control. When medicine failed, women turned to magic. The moon is dark. New moon. Women walk to crossroads at midnight, places where four paths meet and where the boundary between the living world and the other becomes thin. In their hands, small bundles, hair clippings, menstrual blood on linen, sprigs of rue, words written on parchment and letters they couldn't read. Cunning women sold charms for 3 pennies and a promise of silence. Bury it where no Christian foot has walked, they said. Speak the words backward 3 times. The child will not take root. This is where medicine ends and magic begins. Where desperation transforms into ritual. Where women, denied knowledge of physicians and forbidden mercy of the church, turned to older powers. The church called it witchcraft. Women called it survival. Rituals varied by region. Some involved phases of the moon, performing certain acts during the waning moon, believing that as the moon diminished, so too would pregnancy. Others required specific locations, crossroads, graveyards, places where executed criminals were buried, sites where the boundary between sacred and profane had been deliberately violated. Women buried bundles and spoke words. Their pronunciation was clumsy. They didn't understand Latin, and these words were older than Latin, garbled through generations until they were sounds without meaning. But they spoke them with conviction, with the faith of the desperate. Some rituals involved invocations to saints the church had never canonized or had actively suppressed. Saint Guinefort, a greyhound venerated by peasants despite ecclesiastical condemnation. Saint Wilgefortis, the bearded virgin, patron of women seeking liberation from unwanted marriages and, in whispered tradition, unwanted pregnancies. These were not prayers found in sanctioned texts. They were spoken in darkness, in secret, with offerings left at rural shrines the church had tried and failed to destroy. Other rituals were more transgressive, reciting the Paternoster backward, desecrating communion wafers by using them in spells, mixing Christian prayers with incantations that called on entities whose names had been forgotten, but whose power was still feared. Women stole consecrated hosts from Mass, wrapped them in cloth with certain herbs, and wore them against their wombs for 3 nights, believing the inverted sacrament would reverse conception. The danger wasn't merely that these methods didn't work, though they rarely did. The danger was discovery. The church was obsessed with policing women's bodies and spiritual practices, A woman found performing these rituals could be accused of sorcery, of consorting with demons, of heresy. The penalties were severe: public penance, excommunication, imprisonment. In some regions and periods, execution. Witch trials of the later medieval and early modern period often focused on accusations of reproductive magic. Women were accused of causing impotence in men, sterility in cattle, miscarriages in neighbors, but they were also accused of using magic to control their own fertility. The act itself, the attempt to interfere with God's design for procreation, was the sin. Women were careful. They told no one, not even sisters. But cunning women who sold charms were arrested on unrelated accusations. Under interrogation, under torture, they confessed to selling charms and teaching spells. They named names, dozens of names. Girls were brought before ecclesiastical courts, 17 years old, denying everything. But testimony was detailed, specific. Charms were found, dug up from crossroads by men who knew where to look. Words on parchment, though garbled, were recognizable as bastardized prayers. Found guilty of sorcery. Sentenced to public penance, forced to stand before church doors for 3 Sundays, wearing only a shift, holding a candle, while congregations spat and cursed. Forbidden from taking communion for a year. Names entered into parish records as practitioners of dark arts. They survived penance, but shame didn't fade. 2 years later, pregnant again, they didn't turn to magic. They turned to pennyroyal instead. They died of liver failure within a week. Bodies too damaged to survive poison consumed in secrecy and fear. The rituals didn't work. But the church's condemnation ensured women kept trying them, kept turning to magic because all other doors had been closed. The forbidden became the only option. There were other methods, each as desperate as the last. Rue. A bitter herb with blue-green leaves mentioned in texts from ancient Greece to medieval Europe. Consumed in large quantities, rue contains chemicals that can cause uterine contractions, but it also causes vomiting, confusion, and in high doses, kidney failure. Women chewed the leaves raw or brewed them into tea, enduring the bitterness in hope of relief that often never came. Savin, a juniper shrub whose oil was known to terminate pregnancies. But savin oil is violently toxic. It causes severe gastrointestinal bleeding, convulsions, and multi-organ failure. A few drops could end a pregnancy. A few more could end a life. The margin was impossibly thin. Ergot. A fungus that grows on rye and other grains, ergot causes powerful uterine contractions. Midwives used it during difficult labors to speed delivery. But in the wrong dose or wrong circumstance, ergot causes gangrene, hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Women desperate enough to use ergot as an abortifacient often died in agony, their extremities turning black as blood flow was cut off. Hot baths followed by violent exercise. The theory was that extreme heat would loosen the womb's grip and sudden physical exertion would dislodge the pregnancy. Women sat in water as hot as they could bear until they became faint, then immediately jumped, ran, or performed strenuous labor. Sometimes it caused miscarriage. More often it caused heat stroke, dehydration, or heart failure. Starvation. Some women simply stopped eating, believing that if they denied their bodies nourishment, the pregnancy would fail. But fetuses are parasitic. They take what they need from the mother's body even as she wastes away. Women who starved themselves often lost the pregnancy eventually, but by then they were so weakened that infection, illness, or simple exhaustion killed them shortly after. Herbal mixtures sold by traveling peddlers. Compounds of unknown ingredients promised to restore regularity or cleanse the womb. Some were harmless placebos, nothing but crushed weeds and hope. Others were deadly cocktails of multiple toxic plants mixed without knowledge or care. Women who bought these potions had no way to know what they were consuming until it was too late. Each method promised the same thing: an end to pregnancy, freedom from a cycle that had already buried mothers, sisters, daughters. But the promises were lies wrapped in hope. What these methods delivered was agony. Convulsions. hemorrhaging, organ failure, infection that turned flesh black and filled rooms with the stench of rot. No monument marks their graves. No chronicle records their names. They are absent from histories written by monks in scriptoriums, from legal codes drafted by churchmen, from medical texts copied in universities where women were not permitted to study. They exist only as warnings in sermons, as anonymous cases in court records, as cautionary tales whispered between midwives. Their deaths were not gentle. Mercury dissolved them from within. Pennyroyal seized their bodies in convulsions. Lead turned their minds to confusion and their blood to sludge. Infected pessaries filled their wombs with corruption. Bindings crushed their ribs and starved their organs. Crude instruments perforated uteri and opened floodgates of hemorrhage that couldn't be closed. And the rituals offered nothing but false hope and real danger of accusation, torture, execution. They died in secret. In back rooms and cottages at village edges, in brothels where silence was currency, in manor houses where shame mattered more than safety. They died alone, or attended only by accomplices sworn to secrecy. They were buried quickly, with lies told over their graves. Fever, they said, childbed complications, God's will. Never the truth. Never the poison, the herb, the violence, the desperation that actually killed them. The men who made the laws never carried pregnancies that would kill them. Never faced starvation because another mouth meant death for all. Never felt their bodies break under the weight of childbirth after childbirth, each one rolling dice with mortality. They wrote their prohibitions in clean Latin on good parchment, and they enforced those prohibitions with the full weight of church and state. They condemned the methods as sinful, the women who used them as murderers, the knowledge itself as heretical. But condemnation didn't stop the practice. It only drove it underground, into shadows where knowledge became corrupted, where dangerous methods became more dangerous still, where women couldn't seek help when poisons failed or infections spread. Prohibition didn't save lives. It simply ensured the deaths would be hidden, uncounted, ungrieved. These 14 methods, mercury and lead, pennyroyal and tansy, crocodile dung and honey, binding and bloodletting, backward prayers and buried charms, rue and savin and ergot and starvation, were not evidence of ignorance. They were evidence of intelligence working within impossible constraints. Women observed cause and effect. They experimented. They passed down knowledge through generations. They understood, often better than male physicians who condemned them, what substances and practices could end pregnancy. The tragedy wasn't that the knowledge was wrong. The tragedy was that knowledge was incomplete, unsupported, criminalized, that women had to work in secret with partial information and impure materials, that they couldn't refine methods through open practice and shared learning, that when poisons took too much, when infections spread too far, when bleeding wouldn't stop, they couldn't call for help without confessing to acts their society deemed unforgivable. We don't know their names. We cannot count their bodies. But we know they existed because the methods existed, documented in medical texts and court cases and ecclesiastical condemnations. We know they suffered because the methods were brutal. We know they died because the methods were deadly. The cost of control was measured in women's lives. Thousands of them, each one a person who knelt in darkness with poison in hand, who wrapped binding cloth around her ribs until breathing hurt, who buried charms at crossroads and prayed to forbidden saints. Each one making the only choice available when all other choices had been taken away. Their bones lie in churchyards from England to Italy, from Spain to Poland. And the methods that killed them, banned, forbidden, condemned, continued in secret for centuries after, claiming new victims in each generation until medicine and law finally changed. History does not remember them, but their story matters, because the desperation that drove medieval women to drink mercury and swallow pennyroyal and insert filth into their bodies still exists today. The circumstances have changed. The methods have changed. But whenever women are denied safe options, whenever reproductive control is criminalized, whenever desperation meets prohibition, the result is the same. Women die in secret, and history pretends not to notice.